Welcome to Toasting the Classics, the podcast where we take something that people call a classic and we drink something while inspired by the classic while we talk about it. We're going to decide whether it's actually a classic at the end of the whole thing. My name is Dave McArthur.
My name is Clint Lanier.
You had a free choice. You could have
I
chosen
did.
anything. You could have
Yeah, I could
chosen
choose anything in
a
the
can of
world.
green beans. But
That's it.
what did you go
Yeah.
with?
I went with something that honestly I had never listened to before. It's
Oh, really? Oh, that's
That's right,
interesting.
which
Okay.
is one of the reasons
All
I
right.
picked it. So this is Sex Pistols' one and only album, debut, and
Only
uh,
studio album. Yeah.
only studio album. Right? It's 1977's Never Mind the Bollocks. Here was it? Here come the Sex Pistols, or here are the Sex Pistols. Just never mind the Bollocks. How's that?
Never mind the Bollocks. Here. Yeah. Is it
He
Here
here's
Comes?
the here's the Sex Pistols. Yeah,
Here's
there
the
you go.
Sex Pistols,
Yeah,
right? I actually
right.
had forgotten about the second part of the album. I was kind of
Yeah,
surprised when I saw that. I was like, oh, interesting. Okay. I don't know if that qualifies as my biggest surprise. That's a dumb.
yeah. Well, it's still
So,
it's a surprise.
so we're making a little change on the podcast. Normally, what we do is we do all things from 1974 because that's the year that you were born. This time, we're finally doing something from the year I was born, which is
That's
1977.
right.
So
That's right.
we're gonna make a big improvement. And I also
That's
know
right.
why you chose this. It's actually
Okay.
has to do with the fact that you just related to everyone. They only have one album,
Oh,
only one
right.
studio album,
Yep.
which means we can avoid the whole confusion we had with Johnny Cash, where I
Yes.
listened to the
Yes.
completely wrong
That's
album. That's
exactly
not
why I
going to
chose
happen.
this. Yes, that's
Yeah,
exactly why I
exactly.
chose it. Actually, I
Yeah.
was wondering. I have to admit, a couple of days ago, I just had this fleeting little thought about. I wonder, after I found out that they like recorded something in '96, I wonder if he would pick that. But I thought, no, no,
No,
Dave's a
no, no,
smart
no. I know
guy.
better than that. I know
He's
better
been
than
to
that.
Ivy League schools. He's a
I have
smart
not ever been
guy.
to an Ivy. I do not want people
Well,
thinking you've been to an Ivy League school.
well,
I've never even hardly walked on the campus of an Ivy League. That's not true. I
what?
did walk through Harvard.
No. Yeah, well, no. What do you call what's the school you went to in New Orleans? Was that?
It's like a Southern Ivy, maybe kind of like
Yeah,
Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt,
right. Yeah,
Tulane,
see. So maybe
Rice. There's yeah,
it's
so
a
yeah.
junior Ivy. I mean, come on, it's a
If
private
if
school, and it's
if the South had won the war, Tulane would be in the
right. Yeah.
more
Well,
like the
you
Gravy League or something. So
yeah,
I don't
you'd
know.
be in the money then. Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyway, here we are. So, had you listened to this album before?
Oh yeah, yeah. I owned this one. So I had a circle of friends when I was in high school and even before high school, and
Mhm.
a lot of them were like pretty hardcore punks.
Uh-huh.
I was never really into it because, and I would basically, I asked one of my friends in that group did they like the Smiths at all? And he tried to
Mhm.
sing the song, and I realized, oh, he's tone deaf. That's why this is the music he listens to.
Oh
Like
yeah.
I,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I love the aesthetic. The aesthetic
Yeah.
of punk is very cool. It's
Hmm.
very alluring, and I thought that was it. But it also, I think, for that to be all the music you listen
Hmm.
to, I think you kind of have to have a little bit of a tin ear
Have to be
because
tone deaf. Yeah.
musically, it's just not ringing those pleasure
Right.
centers of the brain. I don't think. But
But let me clarify real quick. So I hadn't listened to the album, but I
no,
know the song "Anarchy in the UK." Everybody knows
of
that
course,
song. I
yeah.
also know the song "God Save the Queen." Everybody
Hmm.
knows that song. So I know those songs. I had never listened to like "Bodies" and the "Holiday." I
Pretty
mean,
Holiday in the Sun,
"Holidays in the
Holidays in the
Sun,"
Sun. And
right?
I get that mixed up
Problems
with
and blah blah
Holiday in
blah.
Cambodia by the Dead Kennedys, by the
Right,
way. So I
right,
kind of
yeah.
want to say that, but it's
And
not
that's
the
the
same.
thing, when I was a kid in the '80s, I listened to like the Dead Kennedys, DK. I listened to
Yeah.
the Circle Jerks, the Dead Milkmen, JFK, Jodie Foster's or JFA, Jodie Foster's Army, Butthole Surfers. So I listened to this
Yeah.
Pennywise. I mean, all these punk bands, and then of course in the '90s you got Green Day and Offspring and a lot of other punk. So I've listened to a lot of punk. Black Flag.
I
Uh,
think Green Day is the moment when it was always in danger of being co-opted, obviously, by
yeah,
people with money, and it was right away. And Richard
yeah,
Branson is involved in this album for God's sake, the guy's one of
exactly, right.
Britain's biggest billionaires. But I think Green Day is the moment when it was just like we're gonna look like we're punk, but if you really listen to the music, this is alternative rock. This is something
Yeah,
completely different. It's
yeah,
Green Day. The first time I heard Green Day, I was like, "That's
yeah,
great. I want to listen to that.
sure.
That sounds good. Those are good
Yeah,
songs."
yeah,
It's a completely different experience than listening to the Sex Pistols.
yeah.
Although I got out my guitar and I played through Anarchy in the UK, and that one actually has a little bit of an interesting melody to it
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
surprised me. I was playing it, I was like, oh, okay, this one you can actually hum along
Yeah.
to if you're not doing Johnny Rotten's whole thing,
Yeah.
which sounds very different. But there's a little bit of musicality to it.
Yeah.
It's pretty repetitive. It's a
So,
lot of the
so
same.
do you
Go
want to
ahead.
give the backstory here on this whole thing?
It's your thing. I'll talk along with you. Go ahead and tell me what you
Okay,
tell me what you.
so this is recorded in 1976, released in 1977. The
Mhm.
band composed of various people, but Sid
Various
Vicious,
people, yeah.
Johnny Rotten are the two most famous. And
And
uh,
Sid, I think Sid's famous not because of the musical involvement in the band,
no,
I
not
don't
at all.
think.
Sid's famous for Sid. Sid's
Yeah,
famous for antics. You mentioned aesthetics, and we'll get back to that. But that was all Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious was
right.
nothing but aesthetics. And the McLaren, the manager,
I
kind
think
of
so, yeah.
all but said that. Like, he looked the part.
Johnny
It's
Johnny
for
Rotten called him a coat hanger. I watched an interview and they said that he was like Sid Vicious was just a coat hanger. And I
yeah,
was like,
yeah.
whoa, okay, that's nice. But then later he's like, he's my mate and he'll always be my mate. So I'm like, no,
Yeah, well, he's the one that
maybe don't trammel his
he's
memory
the
that
one
way.
that brought him into the band. The two of them were school buddies together and stuff like that. And there's something in their story that I've learned about before, but I guess I really didn't understand it. 1970s was a pretty depressing time for first world countries. In America, that's where you had a lot of this kind of urban blight and factories are shutting down. And you're there in New York. I mean, so much of New York was just absolutely
Yeah,
wasteland.
absolutely.
In Manhattan was
We
totally wasteland.
The block I'm on would have been a war zone back then.
Yeah.
It's
So and
hard to imagine.
like
But the crazy thing,
the
the
Warriors and all
set
that other stuff was set there, and for a reason.
the Warriors was set here, but the Warriors is obviously, I don't think
It's a
100% true to life. It's a
dystopian future.
dystopian vision of
Yeah.
what New York, yeah. It's
Yeah.
a little bit, yeah. But it also rang true with a lot of people who watched the film at the time. So some of it had to do with the perception. And so I have this. We've doing this show. We've done a lot of material from the 70s,
Mhm.
and the one thing I could state about the 1970s, no matter what you think, is it was an incredibly fertile time culturally in America.
It was, but
Either
but
either there was enough momentum left from, the boomers getting older, or maybe some of that rundownness allowed some people to live in the city and actually, I don't know, we talked about this before with 60s London was a very similar effect, but
well,
like 70s New York,
maybe I'll get
you got
back to
rap
that
and punk,
a little bit on political ideology, but
Let's have a beer while we talk
apparently,
about this.
yeah, yeah, yeah. By the way, we are drinking. We're drinking Guinness. Cheers. The reason we're drinking
I'm coming
Guinness
very close to spilling Guinness. Did you get Guinness in a bottle or Guinness in a can?
hello, it's got the
I
CO2 in
went
it.
can too. Why did you go can?
Because it's got the
Oh, because
CO2, yeah, or the not CO2, but the nitrous gives it that cream. Johnny Rotten, John Lydon is Irish,
yeah.
and apparently all they drank was either pure whiskey, which I didn't feel like doing at 11
No.
o'clock my time, or just
No,
beer.
no, no. That's yeah.
And
Thank you for that. Thank you
of
very
course,
much for that.
yeah, and most of their antics involved throwing beer cans or beer bottles at people, which we'll get into, I'm sure. So I was like, oh, let's do beer, and of the
All right.
beers, let's do Guinness, which is
It's funny.
actually a light beer, but
Maybe I'm just a cultural chauvinist as at least partially being an Irishman, but
uh,
a lot of the great English bands
mhm.
have Irish people who aren't really Irish. They don't really identify. They don't, what's the word? They don't have Irish accents. They're
Mhm.
born in
Mhm.
Britain. But like Morrissey,
Yeah,
who's more Irish than Stephen Patrick Morrissey? That's an
yeah,
Irishman.
yeah,
And he is. They're
yeah.
immigrants from Ireland to Britain and he grew up there. There's a lot of that going on I
There is
mean,
a
Ed
lot.
Sheeran. There's a lot of British people who are of Irish descent that are
I
the great
think,
musicians.
well, I think there's if not Irish, I think not London. I think that's the
That's
point.
definitely true. That's
That
definitely true.
you don't see really any, and so you can call me on these outliers, but obviously you've got Liverpool for Oasis and the Beatles, or I should say the
Uh-huh.
Beatles and
Yeah.
Oasis. But you've
I
got
identify the
working.
Rolling Stones as being more or less London, but I don't know. And I know Radiohead's from around closer to London than these
Maybe
I think we
so.
think of Manchester,
Like I said,
Birmingham, but
there's gonna be outliers for sure. But I just think you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot of Irish influence, but I think it's a bit of the at the time when they're writing it. And getting back to my point, when America was like suffering through urban decay in the 1970s, England had it even worse. England had
oh yeah,
taken this huge socialist bent in the 1960s that just
right.
laid waste to their industrial power. They had strikes. all the time. You had all these companies, and the government had really gone socialist, and it decimated their industry.
Yeah, it's a
Well,
little more nuanced. Yeah, but some of
there,
it has to do with the socialists actually keeping industries going that had no business going. And then when Margaret Thatcher closed those industries, then you've got like a tinderbox ready to go off. You got
my point is
people
the seven
people who
the
shouldn't have been
seven
working in those things for
my point is
yeah.
the 70s were a dismal dry time, Mr.
Hmm.
Smarty Pants.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not here for nuance. I'm here for just generally speaking in that decade. Lydon, Johnny Rotten says it
I
multiple
say
times.
Lydon. Is it? I think it's John
Lydon,
Lydon. I think
he
so.
says it in multiple interviews that they had
Lydon.
no opportunity. There was violence everywhere. It was, why go to school? It was one of those things. It was almost like a third
Yeah.
world type of mentality where it's, you're never going to get ahead, especially for a working class bloke. Why even worry about it? That's sort of the genesis,
It's very
crucible, whatever
Gen
you want to
Z.
call it. Yeah, very, very
Very
much
Gen Z.
so.
It's the way Gen Z
Yeah.
talks, but Gen Z doesn't act this way. Gen Z just sits at
No.
home, watches PORN
Well,
and
see, the difference is somebody in that generation, Johnny Rotten's generation, literally had nothing to look forward to. They had no Uber, they had no government subsidies, they had nothing, and there was threats of violence on every street corner, as they always said. Gen
yeah.
Z though, government. I mean, there's so many programs that subsidize them. They'll sit at home with a brand new, with the newest iPhone, ordering Grubhub, and complain about lack of opportunity, and how bad they have it. So
Have you ever seen the movie? It's got John Travolta and maybe Harry Belafonte. I'm not sure, but it's called White Man's Burden.
yes,
And it's like
yeah,
it's really kind of a lame high concept. It's just what if it
yeah,
was white people who were poor and black people who were the elites? But
right.
one of the things that really jumped out in that movie to me is there's this part where they go through the white ghetto and
Hmm.
they're at this burger place and all
Hmm.
these everybody there is like a tough looking punk rocker listening to like punk music. And I'm like, of course, that's totally what it would be. That's what this is. This is the music of violent, oppressed young white men.
Yes,
This is
yes,
this is how they manifest the
yes,
same thing as
absolutely,
gangster rap.
yes,
And you
yeah,
would not
absolutely,
want to walk through a crowd of those guys any more than you want to
yes,
walk through a crowd of like
right. They're,
gangbangers in
like you said, violent.
1995, you know?
I was thinking the other day. I was thinking yesterday because I've been, of course, I do my research. I'm very diligent about this. So I started like 5 weeks ago on this.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but as I saw my daughter donning her white Doc Martens yesterday, I started
Hmm.
wondering, like, was it the Sex Pistol generation? Was it that era that gave Doc Martens their punk vibe? Because
A little later,
Doc,
right? Is it?
no, I think if we look, I think the 70s is when the punks started wearing
Okay.
Doc Martens into the 80s. I remember a famous ad from Doc Martens, right? And it was an English bobby back when they had those. It was an English bobby with his billy club out, and he's running down the street, and in front of him is this miscreant ne'er do well also running. So obviously he's chasing the ne'er do well. And the ad it was for Doc Martens, and the ad said, "One of these two men is wearing Doc Martens. Can you guess which?" And it's the cop that's wearing the Doc Martens, not the criminal,
Oh,
because
okay.
they're trying to say, look, Doc Martens are for guy, for people who are on their feet all day, who
Huh.
who are in the
Yeah.
factories. Like that's what Doc Martens are for. But it's become this different thing. I think the 70s punks, probably, and it would make sense because they're working class, they're working in factories, they get off and they go, they get off of work and they go to these punk bars and stomp each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Waffle stompers, as
Yeah,
they
well,
call them.
it grows out of that blue collar reality, right? It's like
Yeah,
you're a blue collar guy, you're not very well educated, right?
yeah,
The town is tough, so you have to be kind of violent to protect yourself, and then that
right.
becomes the culture. I was talking about the DC punk scene, like
Hmm.
DC hardcore scene was really famous, even infamous. Like I remember reading
Hmm.
an interview the Beastie Boys were talking about they didn't like going down to DC because the shows were just incredibly violent. And I think it was because DC was more violent, like it was a dangerous city. If you were
It's
hanging
still
out,
still a dangerous
you
city,
know,
just in a different
it's still a
way.
dangerous city, but everybody just doesn't live in the city. There's no
Yeah,
people, it's either rich people or poor people.
yeah,
It used to be there was a little bit in the 70s and 80s, there were
yeah.
still some blue collar types living in the
Middle class,
city. I
blue
think
collar.
they were like the
I,
middle
you know,
class
I, I
stuff.
didn't I didn't finish kind of the intro to the album, so let me just finish that because it's sort of
Right.
important.
Okay.
So the band formed 75, 76, and they formed. what's really important is there's this guy named McLaren who is sort of at, I think that's his name, right? McLaren? Is that the
I think
manager's
so.
name?
Yeah.
He was sort of at the center of it. He owned a fashion store called Sex, and they sold like this weird BDSM type of clothing or whatever. The guy was an artist, and he became like a manager for different bands, punk bands, really, like the New York Dolls and so forth. He kind of put together this band. He sort of based it on aesthetics. It was more about, for him, it was more about a movement based on looks more than music.
Hmm.
So, like for example, they had the bassist and I think the drummer and the guitarist, and they're looking for a lead singer, and they're like, we need somebody who has short hair. That was like how they measured who they would interview for this, right? Because everybody had long hair like hippies, or they found this guy Johnny Rotten, John Linden, who had short hair that was dyed green. And they're like, you would be perfect. He had a shirt on that said, it was a Pink Floyd shirt. And he had written
Hmm.
in felt pen, I hate above the Pink Floyd album
Yeah.
or Pink Floyd logo.
Yeah.
So it says, I hate Pink Floyd. It was like, all jacked up. So he looked punk. And the guy's like, you're perfect. So the manager was really into, I mean, it was like almost like an art project for him. Like, how can I sculpt this, so that it creates a movement or it captures a movement or something like
Yeah.
that. And the guy was very demeaning, overbearing, kind of typically take all your money type of terrible manager, music manager in the 70s. And so that's kind of what formed this band. And so this band formed despite this guy, but they were all punks. And they all kind of lived the punk lifestyle, which was, as you said, danger be damned, throw beer bottles at people, get in fights at concerts with your own fans, spit on your
Yeah.
fans, stuff like that.
Spit on your
So they
fans.
did they did all this stuff. So this is through 76 and they're touring. And so they gained prominence even after, they don't have an album yet, barely signed to a label. They've got, I think, one single out, and they go on this kind of like live TV show. It was kind of like a Good Day type of TV show. And
Oh, you're talking about the Grundy
yeah, the
incident?
Grundy episode.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so they swear on live TV. Oh my
Yeah.
God, clutch pearls. And I think they drop an F bomb or something.
They did. They dropped an
Yeah.
F-bomb. They said did you watch the video?
No, I didn't watch that video.
So it gets really ugly, but the moment when it gets really ugly, I watched it twice and I realized it's actually Johnny Rotten being or John Lydon being really cool because they have
Yeah,
Susie from Susie
yeah,
and the Banshees is
yeah.
there
Susie
with
and the
them. She's
Banshee,
not
huh?
really participating in the interview, but the creepy old drunk guy is like, "Oh, could you meet me after?" And she's just like has this look on her face like, "Are you kidding me?" And
Yeah,
I mean, I can't remember if it's Johnny Rotten or the other guy. Anyway, one of them just tears into the dude, drops a couple of
yeah,
F-bombs. He's just like, you're a dirty, dirty, you know what? He
yeah,
just
yeah,
says
yeah,
it a bunch of times. And I was like, no, they're right. They're not being
yeah.
punk there. They're 100% correct. F that
Right.
guy, you
But
know?
the point is for civilized societies, you can't be dropping F bombs on live TV. And
No,
so
no, that's true.
that got
That's
him
true.
banned from live TV, and it made him infamous immediately after that. And then from there, it just kind of, their infamy grew. Like they would go to shows and people would be protesting the shows and like, threatening
Mhm.
them if they decided to play and all this other stuff. So they'd have to cancel shows, or they would go to shows anonymously. Like, there's a
So
band coming. We can't tell you who they are, but they're coming.
number one, number one phenomenon of our lives that reminds you of everything you're reading everything you just said. What's the one band of our lives that repeated this entire phenomenon?
Two Live Crew, probably.
Two Live
I mean,
Crew,
yeah,
100%. When I was reading that, I was like, oh, Two Live Crew was
yeah,
just doing
yeah.
what the Sex Pistols
Yeah,
did
that's
15 years
that's it.
later,
Yeah,
exact same
they
thing,
got
you know?
arrested in Florida for vulgarity and blah blah blah. It's like
Yeah.
and see that's the mistake that people make when they try to censor stuff is they just make it bigger because what
Hmm.
happens is people announce, hey, this has been censored, and everybody says, well, I got to find out why it's been censored. Let me go check it out for myself. So if you want to make a number one selling album, piss somebody off and make make sure they censor it and like don't want to distribute it. So all this stuff happens. They kick out the bassist of the band. The bassist is I can't remember his name off the top of my head. McClintock or something like
Matlock,
that. Matlock,
Glenn
yeah,
Matlock left.
Glenn Matlock. And he was a good bassist, but he apparently liked the Beatles too much. They said he was too much of a pretty boy. So they kicked him out of the band. And Johnny Rotten says, "Hey, let's bring in my mate.
Yeah.
His stage name is Sid Vicious." And then everything goes downhill from there, pretty much. Sid Vicious is a punk cut from the punk cloth. I mean, this guy, the thing is, McLaren said he looks like a good punk. We're going to bring him into the band. He didn't know how to play the bass at all.
No,
Matter of fact, he was
no.
terrible at it. He was a drug addict already. He was a heroin user. He was drunk. He had served time for blinding a girl by throwing a beer bottle at somebody else and the shattered glass at this poor
I
girl at
watched
a concert.
I watched a couple of interviews with John Lydon when he was much older, and he was talking about how just how bad he felt about bringing Sid Vicious into the band and what
Yeah,
ended up happening to him. But at the same time, he said he'd known him for a long time before the band,
yeah.
and he said the guy's mother was on the registered list of heroin addicts. His
Oh no,
mother came one
yeah,
day.
yeah,
She came
yeah,
home one day and gave him a bag of heroin for his birthday in front of everybody,
yeah,
and he was just like, "This guy had no chance." Also, he
yeah.
said he was a moron. He was a genuine just moron, and
Right, right. Well,
it was just
no,
a bad idea,
no.
you
His
know?
his his mom was absolutely. If you go read the story on Sid Vicious, it really is a tragedy. I mean, that's why he did a bunch of terrible things, but you look at where he came from, and you're right, he didn't have a chance, or Rotten's right, he
No.
didn't have a chance. I mean, the guy, his mom was a heroin addict. He was running loose at like 12 years old, and he would go and buy for his mom. Yeah, it was the Sid Vicious story itself. It's just a whole other story. There's a movie made just about him called
Yeah, I always
Sid
wanted to watch that.
Sid
It's not
Nancy.
available. Yeah, sorry, Sid and Nancy, and it's not
Yeah,
available anywhere. I've been wanting to watch it for years, and it's just not. I watched the trailer is on YouTube. It looks cool. It's got Gary Oldman playing
yeah,
Sid
Gary
Vicious.
Oldman. A lot of people don't like it. You
Maybe the
know,
movie sucks, but it looks cool. It's definitely got a good look to
it
it. So I
looks
don't know.
good, and
Yeah,
actually, Gary Oldman looks the part. I mean, he looks a lot
he
like Sid
does.
Vicious.
Yeah, he totally does.
Yeah,
I think that might be just about his first big role, isn't it? Or I don't even know if it counted as a big role, but I think that might be where he got famous. I don't remember Gary Oldman from anything before that, but I mean, he's in Fifth Element and stuff like that a couple years
yeah.
later. So
Let me just look and see, because it came out in 1986, so it was about it wasn't that long after. Well, it was about 10 years after he passed. I don't know. So much of Sid Vicious was about aesthetics, like how a punk should look, with short
yeah,
hair, spiked short hair with a leather jacket, with studs on it, silver stud. I mean, it was
yeah,
that
yeah.
look continued. I was in high school from like 88 to 92, and kids were wearing that exact thing,
Oh,
with,
absolutely.
with
Yeah.
suicidal tendencies and dead Kennedys, and they had the exact same look. Combat boots. It was everything that Sid Vicious did.
The clothes, the hair, the
Uh,
cover of this album is one
yeah,
that every single punk album afterwards was
yeah,
always in my mind what it was supposed to look like. And I haven't read this anywhere, but it's supposed to look like a bill for a show that you just stick up on the wall is what the cover of this album looks like to me. It looks like, you're walking through the
okay.
sidewalk,
Well, like a
and you're
lamppost.
walking through one of
Yeah,
those
yeah,
construction zones and there's things
yeah,
posted all over, and one of
yeah,
them is
yeah,
that,
yeah,
and it looks
yeah.
just like that. It looks like somebody threw
Right.
it together, and it's perfect. I had a
Yeah,
No Effect Pumpkin Drublick when I was older, and it looked pretty much just like that with
yeah.
different colors.
Well, there's so
I
much
think.
about it, and okay, so we've got the backstory.
Hmm.
It's a tumultuous time within the band. A lot of people were kind of at each other's throats. It comes out later that apparently the manager was sort of like coordinating the infighting a little bit, because
Oh,
he wanted it
like
to like
instigating it.
yes, he wanted
Oh
news,
yeah,
right? He wanted it to make the papers. So this guy didn't like that guy, and this guy didn't like that guy, and stuff like that. And I think it was
yeah,
just an experiment for him, for the manager, but it ends up, really costing the band. They do this one album. They're supposed to tour England out of like the 15 shows. I think they can only do half of the shows because people are still banning them for their different behavior and so forth. And
hmm
so they come to America. And it's just about the same after. Well, it's a combination of things. It's because they're being banned because of their language, and then also infighting and just its general ineptitude within the production. They have to cancel like half their shows. Plus, Sid Vicious is strung
yeah.
out. Well,
Yeah.
no, that's afterwards. He's strung out most of the time during the band, and so they get through like less than half their shows, I think, get to San Francisco, and Johnny Rotten's like, "All right, we're done. I'm out of here." And he just leaves. He's like, "All right," after one song, and that was it. And that's all they wrote, And they
And
had the
that was it.
one
Yeah,
they had
exactly.
they had the one album. So it's gosh, it's such it's weird, unique story. You hear about the sophomore slump, so that somebody
Hmm.
comes out with like a seminal album, their first album, and then every album after that stinks. So they come out
Right.
with this album. They are the spear point of a movement, and then they're done.
Yeah.
They're like, I'm out.
Yep.
But what's interesting is so many bands that they directly, like contemporaries, that they directly affected lived on, like the Clash, Susie and the Banshees, the Cure, but they themselves lit the fire, and then they split. But
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're definitely like a huge part of, well, I think it's like what we talked about. And there's a connection I didn't even realize, or maybe we talked about it before, but it's a lot like when Nirvana hit. It's like that. It's like everything's going to be different after this moment, basically.
right,
Is it really true that Nirvana was doing something nobody had ever done before? No, it's not. They're ripping off the Pixies, they're ripping off some people before,
right,
and the Sex Pistols are definitely they're building on New York Dolls and some bands that I can't think of. Oh, Iggy Pop and people like that that were
right,
around in the couple of years before them.
yeah,
But it's definitely sort of the culmination and like the moment when this becomes. I mean, they're doing interviews. I saw some that Grundy interview. The guy's like, "Oh, it's this new thing called punk," and they tell me it's a big deal. He's never heard of punk, even though it's been around for 3 or 4 years before that. It's the first time. It's the first one to really be in the public consciousness in the same sort of way. So it
right.
really is a big moment culturally in 1977 with this. I don't know, maybe I'm biased. I always thought that Johnny Rotten was super, super cool. I'm aware that he's kind of an a-hole also, but when I was a kid, they had a Public Image Limited had a video on MTV, and I remember watching the video, and I knew who the Sex Pistols were, but I'd never seen a video with Johnny Rotten,
Mhm.
and I didn't know it was the same guy. And I was watching it, I was like, who is that guy? That guy's so cool. I'm gonna go buy that album just because that
Yeah,
guy's so cool. And
right.
so I went and bought it, and that's when I learned who he was. I go back and I watched 6 or 7 different interviews, maybe even more on YouTube with him. And he just has like there's something about his demeanor and the attitude. He's a jerk, but he's a fairly intelligent jerk, which is kind of compelling in a strange sort of way. I think
Mhm.
he's a big part of why the band was what it was. Now they also, like I said, Richard Branson was involved, and apparently Malcolm McLaren was a big deal too. So you got some. We always say this on the show. It's always a collaboration. Nothing is ever born, fully formed. It's not the first thing. Nothing is ever some solo genius, or at least we haven't discovered it yet. But I think he really is the thing that pushes the Sex Pistols over the top and makes them something special that people remember.
Right.
Is just his charisma. I think it's just one person's charisma.
So I was thinking about this when I was reading about them. The managers of rock stars that we know
Hmm.
have so much influence in their story
Hmm.
that we honestly, it's probably they're more than half the reason we even know that rock star, like the Colonel and
Yeah.
Elvis Presley, but also the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles' first manager, if you ever look into that whole story, this guy was sort of cut from the same cloth. I mean, the guy was a music store, or his family owned a music store. He saw the Beatles, said, let me manage you. He did a lot of the same stuff, including like, taking a lot of their money. So it's a combination. There's the aesthetics. They walk the walk. I mean, they were punks, and they would get in fights, throw
Hmm.
beer bottles at people, including their own people, their own security
Right.
and stuff like that. They really just DGAF, if you know what those letters stand for.
I
Like that
do
was sort
because
of their,
I'm a big Dua Lipa fan. So yeah, I
yeah, very
definitely know.
good. Yeah, yeah. So they looked at, but things were set up for them. Like there was, for example, one of the most famous ones is when they came out with their single "God Save the Queen." It happened to
Uh-huh.
come out on the Queen's anniversary, and on the River Thames, there was going to be this kind of river parade for the Queen's Jubilee. And so 3 days before that, their manager rented a boat, and they were going to play "God Save the Queen" as they're sailing up and down the Thames. And people, of course, got really ticked off at that because they were all offended by the song. And the
Uh-huh.
cops stopped them and arrested a bunch of them at the port, stuff like that. It made a bunch of big news, which is probably the whole point of doing it in the first place, as far as the manager is concerned. Like, let's make a spectacle so their name gets in the paper and stuff, right? A lot of it, I think they were kind of set up. I don't want to say set up to fail. They were set up for infamy, I think, by this kind of machine that wanted to make money off of them.
Yeah, yeah,
You know what I
absolutely.
mean?
The interview where he was talking about apologizing for bringing Sid Vicious into the whole thing, he's saying, I mean, the guy just couldn't handle it. He was not very bright. He was in
Yeah,
over his head, and he was like, and we all were, and fame is a horrible thing, and it's a
yeah,
miracle that any of the rest of us are here alive
right.
today, having gone through this
Yeah,
thing. So I
yeah,
thought there's
and
something funny that you brought up about God Save the Queen. You're talking about the Jubilee and like,
mhm.
I guess British patriotism essentially is what it's
Yes.
making me think of.
Mhm.
Because there's a line in Anarchy in the UK where
Ah,
he's going through all these abbreviated things. He's like, is this the LRA? And I'm like, I don't know
yeah,
what any of that is. I've never heard
yeah,
of any of those organizations or whatever.
sure.
But he ends it with saying, or is this the UK or just
Just
another
another
country?
country. Yeah.
And that's like you're complaining about your country, but by phrasing it that way, you're saying you think the UK should be something special and should be better than other countries.
Yes.
Is this
Well,
the UK or is
well,
this just any old country?
he, no,
You know?
he has said multiple times in interviews that this was not a slight. This was a celebration of England. He was
Right.
saying that England needs to better represent the working class. Like that, this is what made us great. We are a great country, and we're losing that. And you need to come back to that. You know what's interesting? Okay, I started looking into the politics of Johnny Rotten.
Oh boy.
Have you?
Okay.
Oh boy, he voted for Trump
I
all
didn't
three
know that.
times. All three
Okay.
times he voted for Trump.
But isn't that just him being like F you to everybody? I mean, isn't
It
that a
is.
like a
It is.
protest? Yeah, okay.
He said, I want somebody who will shake up the politics. I don't want a
Wait,
politician.
wait, here's the elephant in the room. Has he become
Yeah.
American?
He has three, he actually has three citizenships. He's a
Oh,
citizen of Ireland,
weird.
England, and the US. Yeah. And what's funny is the whole Trump movement, it's not conservative. If you were a traditional conservative of like 1960, you're very disappointed in Donald Trump because he's not at all, he does not represent you. Trump is like a very much a populist. This last election, they sort of got the blue collar vote. When they've got unions endorsing the Republican, something's going on. And that's
Right.
what's funny about Johnny Rotten is that's what from day one he's always said is like the working class, the working class, the working class, the blue collar, the working class. That's what he's always been about. And he
Hmm.
and he swears up and down that God Save the Queen. That's what the song is about. And it's really funny because Morrissey, this is what's funny about it. Morrissey is the same way. Morrissey says the exact same thing. He's like working class, working class. I like Donald Trump. It's like working class, working class. And I think all
Morris,
of
he
them are
said he
saying,
likes Donald Trump.
yes,
Okay,
all
that's
of them,
weird. That's weird.
well, no, because all of them said down with the establishment.
So
What's more
Morrissey's
punk?
become a
What's
log
more
cabin
punk?
Republican, I guess.
Nope. What's more punk than that? And
Well, yeah, yeah.
We've talked about this before. Like when Rage Against the Machine is telling you to get your vaccine and wear a mask at their concerts, that's no
Hmm.
longer Rage Against the Machine. That's raging with the machine at that point, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, we've talked about the sort of dance between which part of the political spectrum is more favoring the government, right? Like who's afraid of the government, who's in favor of the government, and it's changed. It's been this dance going
yeah,
on through our whole lives between
yeah,
who was more favorable. It used to be the hippies hated the government, and now it's the people who used to be hippies are the ones that love the government and want the
yeah,
government to do everything
embracing it
for
or
them.
something like that. Yeah.
And the whole one of the big stories, I still don't know where I come down on what I think of this, but one of the big stories of the last election is that the Trump movement has finally completed a move to have the Republicans suddenly be the champions of the working class.
Right.
Because theoretically that was always the Democrats. And
Right.
that has always seemed to be to sort of be dying. Like that's been kind of, the idea of like a John F. Kennedy type like union worker who's a big Democrat. They still
Yeah.
existed when we were kids and they were
Hmm.
still a big movement, but you've sort
Right.
of seen that being less and less what's representative of the
Yeah.
work of the Democrats. The
Right.
Democrats are college educated people, doctors and
Yeah.
lawyers,
Hmm.
people
Right.
that look down their noses at people that work in factories,
Right.
basically. It's a little bit paradoxical, right? Because they're like, oh, we really want to vote to like help out all these people,
Mhm.
but we also think that they're pieces of crap at the same time.
Right. Right. we
Like,
feel sorry for her.
and
Yeah.
so
Well,
and so
yeah,
the
it
Republicans,
was.
so Trump
Yeah.
started this because the Republicans were always like, no, no, we're these rich patricians that we don't
Hmm.
care about,
Right.
people. And now it's
Right.
become a different kind of Republican who's like just embraced the lower classes, basically.
Yes.
They're just like,
Yeah.
we're the plebeian party all of a sudden. So
Well,
I don't know.
it's not the lower classes. I think it's like this kind of broad middle class, that exists in America, that because you have a lower class that's supported by this middle class, and you could argue that you have an upper class that's also supported by this middle class, right? And the Republicans are saying like, "Hey, middle class, we're about you." So I don't know. I just found it really interesting and kind of funny that you've got like the quintessential punk rocker. I'll get to Morrissey in a minute, but the quintessential punk rocker, Johnny Rotten, voted for Trump 3 times. But the reason he did it, he admittedly did it because down with the establishment, which is punk rock. I mean,
It
that's the
is, and
value of punk
it's
rock.
actually
And
it
and
actually
so he
opens a
sees
really
it.
interesting if you don't it opens a really interesting conversation because if you hung out around punk people, there's a dark side to the punk movement. It's
Mhm.
very anti-establishment, but it's also pretty white. Although I have to say, from DC, there were always black punk bands, but that's a different phenomenon. But anyway,
Mhm.
there was always this sort of dark racist edge
Mhm.
to punk rockers. There were a lot of skinheads, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's kind of comparable to what you see with kind of the dark side of the Trump movement. It's like there's definitely some percentage of the people at his rallies don't like Mexicans. They're there because they want to kick all the Mexicans out.
Mhm.
I don't think it necessarily represents the whole movement. I'm not trying to say that. And I don't think it represented the whole punk movement. There's a bleeding between the edges between like, oh, F the establishment and being like, you can't tell me not to be racist.
Mhm.
There's a border between that starts to blur a little bit. And you get
I
some of
think,
those same
but
people,
I think you can say
you
that on all sides, though. A-holes exist, just
know?
period, and a-holes will
Absolutely.
exist
Absolutely. They're different. They're
spec
different A.
in
No.
the
Yeah, yeah,
spectrum.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
what did you think of the album? I mean, look, we've been doing this for we haven't even
So
really
the
talked
album,
about the music.
I think the album reflects everything we're talking about. It has a cool aesthetic. It was a big movement. I think the album, in terms of the music, is you listen, it starts out, it's got this great driving bass beat and like a good fast drum beat. And then you listen to four or five of them and you're like, okay, I heard the first couple. It isn't really like, there's really no difference between most of the songs, except that Anarchy in the UK stands out as a single, I think. And what I realized is they had four singles that were released that were off of this album or associated with this album or ended up on this album.
Yeah.
And by the fourth one, people weren't buying them anymore. And it's
Hmm.
like, yeah, I think that's kind of what you got. You're in it for the image, and after you've heard like the fourth song, you start to be like, okay, yeah, I get
Hmm.
what you're doing here. Not
Yeah.
I'm not gonna go buy the single of the fourth song off of Never Mind the Bollocks. But I do think it's very cool. And I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. It is fun to listen to. It's only 36 minutes, 37 minutes, something like that,
It's like
which is
38 minutes and like 22
yeah.
seconds.
Yeah, there's something to be
Yeah.
said for that too. I mean, it's kind of
Yeah.
cool to listen to something that's a little bit shorter.
One of the criticisms was it was like four singles, and it's kind of true. I mean, they released all this music before they released the album, but it was basically because they really didn't have any music. They're doing a lot of covers and so forth. The music itself, if
I
you
mean, the
listen,
fact that it's pretty easy to do is sort of the
uh-huh,
point, right? It's DIY
yes,
is kind of the aesthetic of punk. So that's sort of, I mean,
right,
I'm saying, oh, they're not that complicated songs. It's like, no, they're not supposed to be. And the
right.
message, the revolution, all that's sort of the point.
That's
Like,
okay, right?
okay,
With
yeah.
this kind of genre, I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
It's definitely part of the genre. It's just
yeah.
if you just listen to the album, I'm talking just musically, you listen to the album, you're probably not going to come away being like, "Oh man, like that was, a phenomenal." I actually watched an interview they did on Letterman or an appearance they did on Letterman in the 90s. They got back together, obviously with the exception of you know who, but they got
Mhm.
back together in the 90s and they were performing. And they got out there and they started with Pretty Vacant, which has
Mhm.
this really just absolutely basic yet distinctive lead. It's just an E minor and a little
Mhm.
arpeggio, like to start it out. And it's like
Mhm.
that song right away when you hear it. But they play and they're so much better. Like you could just hear it's the
Right.
same song, but the band has just got way better chops. And you're
Yeah.
like, oh, this is a good band playing this song. It's completely different. Part of it is because you don't have a guy who doesn't know how to play the bass being involved in the performance.
Right.
But it's also just they're 20 years older and more mature and they know what they're
Yeah.
doing. So it's notable. You can see that they're much better musicians than they had been in the
Well, I would
past.
hope so after all that time.
Do you think your musical ability, like your ability to play the guitar, does it decline the way like your ability to play football does? Do you start
No,
going downhill at 40 or?
I think it gets much better. There's a really interesting documentary about Glenn Campbell. Glenn Campbell, it was a country music star in the 60s and 70s, but he was an amazing guitarist. He could play like 12 string, and I mean, just an amazing guitarist. And the documentary is about him getting Alzheimer's and dementia, rather. He went downhill really quick. However, they could put him up on a stage, even in the midst of like not remembering who his wife was, not remembering who his daughter is, anything else. And he could play all of the songs that he wrote
Oh yeah, we were talking. That's
from
right.
like
Yeah.
70 years ago or something. They did like an MRI on him as he like played, and they could see like it would activate parts of his brain that would not otherwise at all be activated. And so I think that's something that improves as you get older, because it's a technical skill, just
Yeah.
like anything else, right? And
I mean, I guess as long as you avoid getting arthritis or something like that that could come with old
yeah,
age,
well,
then,
that's certainly
you
true.
know,
But I think
yeah.
it's there's also muscle memory and the mechanics, and like if you
Hmm.
pick up a guitar, if you never played a guitar and you try to play a G or something, you're like, oh, this is weird,
Yeah, yeah,
your hand,
yeah.
trying to get, make the chord. It's like, ugh. But after you've done it for 30 or 40 years, it's just second nature.
When I when I think of the letter F now,
Uh-huh.
I can see where my fingers go, like automatically. Just the letter
Yeah,
F. I'm putting a bar on the first fret, like it's
yeah.
just immediately in my head. It's
When
very
I think of the
strange. Like
letter F, I think of where my finger goes too.
nice,
Hey, that was
nice.
a good joke.
Good thing
Sorry,
this is
folks,
not a video.
yeah, sorry, folks, you couldn't see my fun fingering.
Yes.
Um,
Clint assures you he's a comedic genius. He's telling you
yes, I
also.
am. Just laugh. Did you read the lyrics on any of this, or did you actually like really pay attention to any of
I
this?
did because Spotify will do a thing where you can watch it go through the song almost like
Uh-huh.
karaoke. It just goes.
Uh-huh.
And I was looking at the song Submission,
Uh-huh.
and it had all the lyrics wrong, and I realized how much the lyrics were repeating.
Yeah.
There weren't like standard. Actually, I'd say that kind of characterizes all the songs. There's not a whole lot of like verse, chorus, bridge,
Yeah.
chorus. There's not a lot of that kind of structure to the songs the
Right.
same way as other things. They just
Right.
kind of go through. But I think it's like what you were saying. When Johnny Rotten was picked up, he's wearing that Pink Floyd shirt that said he hates Pink Floyd.
Yes.
And I saw an interview with him where he was saying he meant to kill rock and roll. He thought
Yes.
rock and roll
Yeah.
was done. It was something that got
Right.
played in malls and it was done and they needed to kill it. It's funny because actually what happened is he kind of like plowed new soil and there was a lot of
Yeah, he did.
fertility that came
Yeah.
out of this
Yeah.
movement for another 15 years. And then I think Kurt Cobain was kind of trying to kill rock and roll all over again.
Yeah.
It
It
did the
certainly
same
seems like
thing.
it. Yeah.
Gave it like another 10 years of life and then yeah, it finally
Yeah.
died. I would say in
It
the early
seems like it.
2000s.
Yeah, for sure. The one that blows me away. So I thought EMI was kind of a funny song.
Yeah.
The last track on the record, they famously got dumped by EMI after being signed with them for 2 weeks. Admittedly, they got in a fight with a couple of the executives, and like threw beer bottles at them and stuff like that. So they made nuisance of them. But they were punks. I mean, come on, this is a punk band that you're
Yeah, yeah.
signing
What
to
are
a
you
record. What do you
expecting?
expect, right? But the one Bodies, have you read the lyrics for Bodies?
No,
The second track? Oh my gosh.
not recently. Not
It's
recently anyway.
it's it's dark. It's about a girl that apparently
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I did.
the abortion
She
song.
just had
Oh
an
my gosh.
abortion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh
yeah,
my
yeah.
gosh. So this girl apparently was like a groupie or something, and she just had abortions all the time, multiple, and was crazy. She showed up with her dead fetus in a plastic bag one day
Jeez.
at Johnny Rotten's apartment. It's like, oh my gosh. And so they're singing about this strange, very demented person. It's such a weird song, man.
I remember that part at the very beginning, but I never actually looked at the lyrics. I'm looking at them
Yeah, look at the
now and
lyrics and read the story about it.
yeah.
I was like, holy cow. But my biggest surprise? Well, how about your biggest
Your biggest
surprise?
surprise. My biggest surprise is kind of, well, I didn't know he was Irish. That's not that much of a surprise to me now.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see that as a pattern in British music. But
Right.
my biggest surprise, I guess, was that I had always interpreted the title of the band to be like, never mind all those people who are the Bollocks. Here comes the
Oh, I
Sex
see.
Pistols.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I heard where he said it was never mind the Bollocks, as in like quit talking. What's a good way to put it in American English that doesn't involve a swear, but
Quit talking BS.
quit
Yeah,
talking BS, basically. Get
yeah,
stop the
yeah,
BS. Here's the Sex Pistols. That kind of I
yeah.
was like, oh, I kind of
Right,
like that
right.
better. That's a better
Yeah.
version of the title than what I
They
was
actually
thinking.
went to court for that. They had to. There was a lawsuit about the name, and so
Yeah.
they had to
Right,
show
right, right, right.
that the name wasn't vulgar, it wasn't obscene, and the way they did that was they Bullocks is in the name of like place names, city names, street names,
Yeah.
all
Bible.
over
Was
England,
it an
right?
early translation of the Bible into English before the
Yes,
King
yeah.
James?
So all kinds
Yeah.
of stuff. So yeah, that was kind of
Yeah,
funny.
definitely. I also was
I
surprised that they had a confrontation with Queen
mm,
and Freddie Mercury just picked Sid Vicious up and threw him out the door. And I was like, I would pay to see that. I would
yeah,
really enjoy seeing
that means
it.
that Sid Vicious must have been a very little person.
I don't know. Freddie
Or
Mercury
Freddie
looks pretty
Mercury was
tough. I don't know. Yeah.
bigger than I thought. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean he's pretty muscly. I don't know. I mean he's probably if you're going
Better
out to the
shape.
gay bars, you got to stay in good shape, you
I
know.
guess if you're strung out on meth and heroin all the time, you probably don't have a
Well,
lot
yeah,
of
that too.
juice
That too. Yeah,
in your
exactly.
muscles. You know, I guess my biggest surprise was just overall in the fact that they were one and done. Just kind of the overall story.
Right.
It's one and
Yeah.
done, and what that led to. Not that I'm trying to motivate you to see it my way, but this is one of the most influential albums of all time, and it was just a one and done thing.
I hate to reverse what we usually do, but I would say I know this album. I grew up with
Yeah,
this album. This
yeah.
album is something I think is a classic. It's not an interesting conversation to me.
Okay.
I think it's better. You've never heard it before.
Mhm.
I think you should get the vote, even though you
Oh, should
picked it.
I?
Because you
Well,
picked
I'm
something
not.
you didn't know, which is I
Yeah.
think cool. I think that's admirable. We should do
Well,
that
I
more.
think I think
You know?
I don't think there's any way that anybody couldn't say this is a classic. Just because, like, for example, I had never heard the whole album. I heard those two songs, but I remember seeing Sex Pistols. Were you around in the days when kids would wear jean jackets and they had like this big patch that would go over like their back, and it would be like the name of a band? So they'd
Yeah,
have
I
like a
think so.
Metallica, like
I
the
think so.
cover. I remember Sex Pistols all over the place in the 80s. 10 years
Yeah.
later, 12 years later, something like that, off of one album. Not a band that's
Right.
touring. It's a band that toured for a little bit, had a bunch of problems, put one album out, and then left. And I was thinking about that. So Johnny Rotten, along with his bandmates, eventually sued McLaren for the rights to their property, including their intellectual property, including the name of the band. It took them until like
Right.
1987 to get full rights and all ownership of Sex Pistols, everything. How much money do you make off of like patches and buttons and all the Sex Pistol branded stuff?
Oh yeah.
They were
Yeah.
making millions in the
Yep.
80s for everybody, not aside all the rip-off stuff, but there's something we should explore later. I want to do a Ramones sometime in the future because
Oh, that'd
there's
be
like
interesting.
this and the Ramones first album. Ramones came out in 76, this came out in 77, and a lot of people compare the two as like which is the most influential punk band, right?
Oh yeah. I actually
um
know less about the Ramones, oddly enough, that considering they're
Interesting.
American.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
I mean, I
Johnny
knew the
Ramone.
Ramones.
There's a
I knew
Johnny
the Ramones, but
Ramone like avenue right down, probably not too far away from you. In fact, do you know that
are they from the city? I feel like they're
they
from
are?
somewhere.
Yeah, no, they're
Oh,
from
they
the
okay.
city, man.
I know they're from New
And
York. I know they're from the New York area, but I can't
yeah,
remember if they live.
look up like Johnny Ramone Avenue or whatever it is. Let's see,
I
Ramone
saw them, by the way. I saw them back in
Street.
the early '90s one time. They were at one of the big shows, like Lollapalooza or something,
Oh, it's Joey
or
Ramone. So there's
Joey. I was
Ramone's
gonna say it's
Way
probably
and
Joey. Yeah.
Joey. There's Ramone's Way and Joey Ramone Place, which
Where is that?
is, let's see,
Hell's
Joey Ramone
Kitchen,
Place
maybe?
is, no, it's Lower East Side. Oh
Oh,
well,
okay.
it's near the former CBGBs. That makes sense, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know where that is. Yeah.
And
There's
it's the
actually, considering this is one thing we were talking about, right across the street from there is this gigantic mural of Bad Brains, which was a really famous like black DC punk band. Like that's why
interesting.
we were
Yeah.
sort of half mentioning them before, but that's it.
Well,
Yeah, I know exactly what that is.
little known trivia is the Joey Ramone street sign is the most stolen in the city.
The
Makes
one
sense,
next to our house is Duke Ellington. He doesn't have quite the same appeal. But
right? What is this Duke doing here?
yeah,
We're not
exactly.
royal. Yeah.
Well, so
Anyway,
what's your
so
vote?
oh yeah, obviously it's a classic. I think this
Okay.
is, they have influenced so many. I was just looking up what's the guy's name that fronts Green Day? Billy Joe Armstrong.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay, so he's gone through a green hair phase. You've got the lead singer of The Offspring, green hair, on and on and on. That's just one little thing. I understand it could be anybody, but Rotten
Do
was
you
the
think my
first to
late
show it.
40s should be my do you think my late 40s should be my green hair phase,
I think it
maybe?
should be your green hair.
Yeah,
Why
I think
not?
that'd be interesting. Yeah, why
Yeah,
not?
absolutely. So I'm just saying that they are probably in my life, they're probably one of the most influential bands because everybody that I listen to says like they were the source, they were the
Yeah,
spring. So
they're
yeah,
kind of a big
absolutely. It's
deal.
a classic. Yeah, kind of a big deal. Yeah,
All
absolutely.
right, cool. Well, then let's
All
toast
right.
it with our
Toasted.
Guinness. We never even mentioned what beer we were drinking, did we?
Yeah, I think we did. Yeah,
No, we
Guinness.
did, we
Yeah,
did, we
just
did, we
yeah,
did,
yeah,
we did.
yeah.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. Anyway, it's Guinness, so and I'm enjoying it. Perfectly
Yeah, you're
good
drinking too many
on
of them, apparently.
a rainy winter afternoon. Perfectly good thing to have. Although it's
Oh,
like
absolutely.
60 degrees. It's like 60 degrees today in New York. It's
60
weird.
and raining. That's weird. Thank you for tuning in, and we are toasting this classic. You can actually write it down now. That if you're worried about it, you now know
Yep,
that
that's right.
Never Mind the Bullocks. Here's the Sex Pistols is
AFI
officially a
is going to get in
classic.
touch with us and find out this should be one of the greatest albums of all time.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. You'll be waiting for their call.
Yep. All right. So for Dave McArthur, goodbye, everybody.
And for Clint Lanier, thank you.